We are sicker than we've ever been. And yet when you mention carnivore or keto to somebody, they will tell you that we don't have enough research to show that's safe. Well, go ahead and show me that what we're currently doing is safe. I saw multiple doctors during this thing. I had that exact conversation. What's your A1C? It's 4.5. What's your A1C? It's 4.5. Wow, that's amazing. Wow, that's amazing. Do you know not a single one of those medical professionals bothered to ask me how I did it? The lack of that sort of innate curiosity and the complacency of a lot of the medical community these days is why we are where we are. The minute you tell them that you're eating keto or, God forbid, carnivore, they'll spend 10 minutes lecturing you on how bad that is for you, but won't take 2 minutes to ask me the question about how I got my A1C into non-diabetic range. That study that was done in pediatrics of all the low-carb, in type 1 grid, all the low-carbers, and they did a study of the people that ate the low-carb diet in the study had significantly fewer hypos than the people that were eating the high-carb because they were using less insulin.
Okay, good morning, folks. Happy Friday morning. Hope everybody's doing well today. We have a guest today. So good morning. We have Sara. Sara, good morning. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm well. How are you?
I'm actually doing quite good. Sara, where are you located, if you don't mind sharing?
I'm sorry, say again?
What part of the world are you located in?
I'm in Michigan, right outside of Detroit, where it is gray and gloomy and has been for about 5 months. So I'm ready for spring.
Yeah, I lived up, when I was a kid, I lived up near Chicago. I remember the Midwestern gray.
Oh, you know what it's like.
6 months of gray. The snow's nice for a couple of days, and then it turns all into gray, black slush, and it's no thanks. Anyway.
Exactly. And the sort of catch-22 of that is the colder it is, the more clear the sky is, right? And the warmer it is, the more gray the sky is. And we've had a really warm winter, so it's just been incessant gray, and I'm over it, frankly.
Interesting. Okay. I guess you've got a bit of a success story you're going to share with us today. So why don't you just maybe start with a little bit about your background?
Sure. From a non-health standpoint, my background is about 35 years in marketing and advertising. Also a fitness instructor in my spare time. I teach spinning and TRX, and I'm an avid cyclist, runner. So super, super active. So the diabetes diagnosis when it happened was quite a shock, actually. And what happened was I was initially diagnosed with gestational diabetes when I was pregnant with my second child and kept that under control as much as I could back then when they weren't really prescribing insulin for women that had GDM. So they really didn't give me any advice on how to control it. They didn't give me a meter. They wanted me to come in once a week and have my blood sugar tested. And I was exactly, how does that help me control anything? Once a week is a useless, pretty much, snapshot. So my husband being in the medical field, and it's funny because if you know about Dr. Bernstein, this story sort of parallels what happened to him. Right? So when he was diagnosed, the only people that could get meters were physicians in hospitals because they were expensive and the supplies were expensive. So it was very similar to what happened to me back in the early 90s. Meters were expensive and hard to come by, and the doctor didn't write me for one. So my husband, being in the medical field, went out and got me a meter. So I started testing my blood sugar, and I started seeing what certain foods were doing to my blood sugar. So I asked to meet with a dietitian, and the dietitian was about 50 pounds overweight and instructed me to have oatmeal with bananas and strawberries or a sugary yogurt in the morning as my breakfast. Low fat, of course, no fat. My lunch was supposed to be an apple or a yogurt and a sandwich. Whole wheat bread is so much better for you. And then dinner was, fish or chicken, no meat. Rice, brown rice, much better for me. And so I immediately saw that none of these foods that she was recommending for me were doing any good for my blood sugar. So I started on my own doing low carb. So fast forward, I have the baby. My OBGYN was like, oh, gestational diabetes, your baby's going to be 12 pounds, blah, blah, blah. He was 8.5 and perfectly healthy. I did manage to really keep things under control. And then I knew that having had gestational diabetes, that my risk of developing type 2 later on was about 50% or 50% greater than the general population. Of course, this was 30 years ago. It's probably even higher than that now. So my doctor, my primary care doctor, we would monitor my A1C at every checkup. And I'm biking and running and doing all these things to keep myself healthy. and watching my A1C creep up for no reason that I could figure out. So I doubled down on all the fitness stuff, doubled down on my clean diet, which was full of fruit and whole grains and all the things that they were telling us were healthy. And then next thing I know, I'm diagnosed with breast cancer. And that was in 2011. I was 51. And I was diagnosed with breast cancer, went through surgery, went through radiation, tamoxifen, and 6 months after finishing treatment, I was diagnosed with type 1. And that happened when I went for a routine physical, and my A1C had gone from like 5.6 to 6.3, and my fasting blood sugar had gone from about 90 to 163. So that was a real sort of wake-up call for me. And I was like, what am I doing wrong? I'm doing everything right. My BMI was 22. I weighed about 130 pounds. I'm 5'5". My weight was perfect. Everything was perfect. And my doctor, who I had been with for a really long time, looked at me and said, well, I don't know what to tell you, diet and exercise. And we both laughed because the irony of that was that she was in my Sunday morning spinning class every Sunday. She already knew what my lifestyle was like. So she put me on metformin, which was the standard protocol. When you're diagnosed as a diabetic as an adult, the assumption is that you're type 2. So went on the metformin. It did nothing for me. And interestingly, Shawn, I don't know if you know this about metformin, but did you know that it raises your resting heart rate or your exercise heart rate significantly?
No, I didn't know that. I know it has some impacts on mitochondria and exercise and kind of blunts some of the response to that. But yeah, wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. So I was on a Monday night group bike ride, and I stopped at a light and I looked at my heart rate monitor, and my heart rate for what would be a normally like aerobic ride for me was like 165. And I'm like, okay, something's not right here. So I researched it, and it does raise your exercise heart rate, but it also, exercise mitigates the glucose moderating effects of metformin. So here you are, it's raising your heart rate, but it's not now it's no longer helping your glucose, right? So I thought that was really interesting. And all of this stuff I really had to learn on my own. After realizing that the type 2 diagnosis wasn't really fitting the profile for me, no metabolic disorders, HDL was great, lipids were great, no high blood sugar or high blood pressure, no belly fat, none of those things, I went to see an endo, and he took one look at me and said, you're type 1. You're LADA, which is latent autoimmune diabetes in adults. So that's where it all came from and started. And then I got put on insulin and told I could eat whatever I want and just take insulin for it. Immediately after, and eating whatever I wanted is a lot different than probably for a lot of people eating whatever they want. I didn't eat junk food. I didn't eat crap. I didn't eat a lot of sugar. Mostly the only sugar I got was in fruit, but I ate a ton of fruit because it was good for me. Eventually what happened was I started gaining weight. I was taking insulin, covering my food. Next thing I know, my weight was up like 15 pounds over the course of about 4 months. Mm-hmm. And so I went to the doctor and said, what should I do about this? Let's double up on your metformin, or let's put you on Victoza or one of those. I'm like, no. So at some point online in a diabetes group, I discovered a couple people that were crushing it. Artie Dykman, Ryan Attar, a few other people that are in the low-carb diabetes community. And I thought, there's something to this. Like, these people are posting these flat CGM lines and they're all fit and healthy, and I'm not feeling that at all. And that's when I found out about Dr. Bernstein's book, and that's when I went pretty hardcore low carb. I'm usually under 30 grams a day now, and I've been doing that for 10 years. So, and I'm in perfect health. My LDL is perfect. All these naysayers out there that are worried about your lipids when you start eating so much protein, it's not always like that. I know it is for some people, the lean mass hyper responders, but for me, I have not had that experience at all. And I honestly have never felt better in my life. I'm 63 and I can still do stuff that a lot of 30-year-olds can't do. So, yeah.
Yeah. I was doing the math when you were telling how old you were in 2011. I said, you look great for 63.
Thank you.
Good testament. And that's one of the things you're lauded, but a type 1 diabetic, the life expectancy for type 1 diabetic is mid-60s. It's about 10 years below, or used to be below what we normally have, which is around mid-70s for the average person, maybe 78, 79 for females in this country. But, you're a long way from that. You can tell. You're not going to keel over anytime soon. But
yeah, I hope not. It's interesting. You look at guys like Dr. Bernstein, he's 87 now and he still works out every day. And, and the problem is that life expectancy is based on people following the standard guidelines that people like the American Diabetes Association put out, and they're failing. They're failing at diabetes and they're failing at health due to no fault of their own. The guidelines are really almost criminal in my mind. But
yeah, I'm interested because you said you were diagnosed with type LADA, or kind of a type 1, so call it type 1.5, and they were still trying to give you metformin and Victoza and some of these other type 2 drugs. Was there any rationale between that?
So I will say metformin, most adults, by the time they're, especially women past menopause, I think we do end up with a certain amount of insulin resistance, even if we're not overweight. And for women that are still having a menstrual cycle, their insulin needs change dramatically during the course of their cycle. And there are periods during their cycle where they're insulin resistant. And I know a lot of people who are in the type 1 group, super low carb, on basal bolus insulin therapy, that take metformin during certain times of insulin resistance. And I think that's a solid strategy. It never really worked for me, so I just don't take it. But of all these sort of adjuvant therapies that could go along with insulin, I think that's the safest and the smartest. Minimal side effects, some really proven good side effects like reduction in risk of cancer has been proven. So it's a safe, effective drug that works really well for a lot of people. As for the now off-label prescribing of GLP-1 agonists and SGLT2 inhibitors, those drugs have some serious side effects. The GLP-1 agonists like Ozempic, for example, right? They're known to cause euglycemic diabetic ketoacidosis. That's not something I want to mess around with. I work really hard to stay out of DKA, and I'm not going to put myself on a drug that's going to increase my risk for it. And the fact that they're now being so readily prescribed for people that just want to lose weight without doing any of the work I think it's really sad. I think it's dangerous. There's a local, very well respected endocrinologist who treats both adults and children, and he's prescribing off-label Ozempic and the other drugs in that class to help his patients take less insulin. Why do they need to take less insulin? Because it's an anabolic hormone. And like me, a lot of times insulin will cause weight gain. It seems like it happens more in women than it does in men, in my observation. But he's prescribing it to them to get them to take less insulin so they don't gain as much weight. And I look at that and I think to myself, why wouldn't you address the diet first? This is the guy that is telling his patients, eat whatever you want and cover it with insulin. Children, teens, adults. I sat next to him at an American Diabetes Association event back when I still supported that organization. And he and his wife, they got their dinner. They pushed the potatoes off the plate. They refused the bread and they skipped dessert. They ate protein and vegetables. So that's how they're eating. But that's not what they're telling he's telling his patients. So that was one of my many eye-opening experiences at American Diabetes Association events. And you really don't want to get me down that rabbit hole because I get ugly. But yeah.
Yeah. So just a point. The SGLT2 inhibitors have been known to cause euglycemic ketoacidosis. I'm not sure if the GLP-1s have been noted for that, but certainly the SGLT2s.
Yes, I believe they both have. I think the other thing and I think it's the SGLT2 inhibitors that are causing those are the ones that excrete sugar. That's how they work.
Yeah, they basically just make your kidneys fail to reabsorb sugar, so you excrete it all. So that's why you can go into diabetic ketoacidosis, but you're still excreting out the sugar, so you can still have that. So that's one of the known.
And then there's all the fungal infections and urinary tract infections and yeast infections that go along with that too. And again, if these are being prescribed as adjuvant therapy along with insulin, why isn't the diet the first line of defense there?
Yeah. No one wants a fungal infection on their genitals, and that's one of the known.
That sounds like a fun way to spend a weekend.
That's one of the known side effects of that one as well. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Just absolute ridiculous ability to address the basic root cause of these diseases, that's really the whole where medicine is these days in general, particularly when it comes to chronic disease. But let me ask you, so just going back through your history, because gestational diabetes with one of your pregnancies, it sounds like back then They didn't have CGMs. They didn't have a good way to monitor you. So it was kind of a cluster as far as how that was treated back then. And because this is, a lot of, is an autoimmune condition. Did you ever have any inkling of anything going on that was pushing you to autoimmune stuff? You weren't eating a junk food diet. It sounds like you were a fit, active person eating a healthy, balanced diet this whole time, and yet you still ended up with this autoimmune condition.
So I did have a history of autoimmune conditions, but I never really thought about type 1 being an autoimmune condition until I learned more about it, right? Because I, like many people, associated it with being a childhood disease, and I've never really associated autoimmune diseases with children either. There's so much that you learn when you realize you don't know what you don't know, right? I had Graves' disease when I was 12. And then by the time I was 19, I had Hashimoto's. So I had already 2 autoimmune diseases. That was one of the reasons that my endo, when I went to see him, took one look at my history, took one look at me and said, "You're not type 2. You've got this history of autoimmune diseases. You're presenting as a thin, fit, healthy person with no metabolic syndrome symptoms at all or indications at all." And to his credit, before my blood work even came back, he put me on insulin. So I got lucky. I got really lucky. Does that answer your question? Because there's a sort of side story that I'd love to share with you.
Yeah, sure. Just the one comment is often autoimmune diseases run in clusters because there seems to be a common perhaps gut pathology that sort of allows that to develop across different diseases. But yeah, go ahead and do your little side story.
Yeah, and interestingly, my sister has rheumatoid arthritis, and my mother had a very rare autoimmune disease that ultimately is what she passed away from. Knowing what I know now, I probably would have been a little bit more alert to it. But so this whole notion that type 1 diabetes is a childhood disease is one of the reasons that so many people are misdiagnosed as type 2 when they present with latent autoimmune diabetes in adults. And there have been several studies done on it. Right now, I just read something that said they think that 10% of people that are diagnosed with type 2 are actually LATA. Okay, 10%. There was an American Diabetes Association consensus paper that they did with the European Association for the Study of Diabetes. The results of that came out in 2021. And they estimate that 40% of all cases of LATA are misdiagnosed first as type 2. And that's high. So let's imagine that 40% of all cases of breast cancer were misdiagnosed as a different type of cancer or misdiagnosed as something else. That's tragic. And the tragedy of that is that in a group that I admin on Facebook that is strictly for people with LADA that have been diagnosed, 64% of them were initially misdiagnosed as type 2. Some of them for 10 years, more, 15 years. Some of them already have retinopathy, neuropathy, gastroparesis. The complications of diabetes that happen when you're treated as a type 2 and you're actually a type 1. And then to make matters worse, I would say probably about 10 or 15% of them were diagnosed when they presented in DKA, a dire medical situation. And so the problem is that they're not being screened. And if you present as a person with impaired glucose tolerance and you're even the least bit overweight, you're automatically bracketed as type 2, right? You're never going to get the antibody testing unless you ask for it. One of the things that I'm really working on right now is I want to do a large-scale study of people that have been diagnosed as LATA. And I want to really understand, and I'm going to include people that are diagnosed as type 2 so I can separate the data sets. And I really want to try to understand why this is happening and how we can prevent it from happening. And if I could start a charity, Let Me Be 83, for people with LADA, I would do that in a heartbeat. And maybe I will. I don't know. We'll see. But,
I'm not familiar with I'm not familiar with what Let Me Be 83 is, but sounds great. Yeah, it'd be interesting to get that because I've run into other people that are the same thing. They initially were treated as a type 2 diabetic, sometimes for years, until they finally figured out that this was an autoimmune condition. And to be fair, there are some diabetics that are poorly controlled, and they're just that chronic hyperglycemia tends to wipe out the beta cells, beta cell function over time. So they become, and then there's type 1s that often look like type 2s, the so-called double diabetes, where they just, and this is a consequence of the ADA diet, just keep eating glucose, keep eating lots of sugar, but just chase it with insulin. And as Dave Dykman and others have pointed out, you never can match that curve very well. It's just, you're always on a roller coaster and you end up with these hyperglycemic excursions, which then further damages the beta cells, and you just, and you become then you become insulin resistant and all.
And it's interesting too, because I can't remember this doctor's name, but he wrote a paper on it, and he was talking about how part of the problem is not only the eat what you want to cover it with insulin thing, but the ease of a pump letting you do that, right? And instead of having to give myself a shot, I'm going to do this and I'm going to give myself insulin. And I think for some people that knowing I have to take a shot for this, right, is a little bit of a deterrent for wanting to constantly feed yourself highly palatable carbohydrate food loaded with trans fats versus having to sit down and think about, I have to take a shot for that. So it's interesting when you think about it that way as well. You're just greasing the skids for that in a way.
You know, I'll just make the comment. You mentioned Dr. Ryan Attar, I've interviewed, and he's a very fit guy. And people that with type 1 diabetes, and if they manage it well and they realize that I've got to really be mindful about what I'm putting in my mouth, they tend to look better than the general population. It's almost like kind of a blessing in disguise, because you're like, I have to eat good if I want to preserve, I don't want to have kidney disease or retinopathy or something like that. So by consequence of that, you look better than most of the population. So I think that's kudos to you and others that manage to do that, because it is, it's a lot of work. I can imagine just always thinking about your blood sugar, and you don't have a pancreas, and am I stressed out? How hard did I exercise? Did I not exercise hard? I said, there's all these numbers that go into it. It's not just food shot. It's how did I sleep? There's lots of things that make variables that you're always calculating. You have to become a pancreas. If your brain didn't tell you when to breathe and you had to do that voluntarily and you had to take a breath all the time, it would be literally exhausting. And I can't imagine listening to the ADA saying, "Oh, just eat whatever, eat cereal and pancakes and just chase it around all day long." It would just be completely, you'd have to get frustrated. And I think a lot of people do. And they're just like, "Oh, screw it. I'm just going to, whatever. I'm just going to have these problems."
I think the place that it is saddest for me, because I'm in a couple of groups for parents of children with type 1, and where it becomes the most sad for me is the disrupted sleep of high and low all night long, the disruptions in school, he had to go to the nurse because he was crashing or he was super high or whatever. And the fact that all of that can be mitigated with diet and that people are so unwilling to do it. And I understand that carbohydrate addiction is real. I get it. I've never been that person. I have sympathy, but I don't know that I have empathy. But that they're unwilling to give up snack cakes and pizza parties and things like that in order for their child to have a school day that's not disrupted in time, but also not disrupted by the cognitive changes that happen when your blood sugar spikes and drops. And those are documented. It's known. I know it myself. I can feel it when I'm spiking. Happened to me the other day, I ordered a bourbon and Diet Coke, and the Coke was not diet. I like bourbon. Bourbon doesn't damage my blood sugars at all. It's wonderful. But yeah, and I could feel myself spiking. My heart was racing. I was confused. And if that happens to me, what happens to a 40-pound child when that happens? I think a lot of the quality of life that I have now is related to the fact that I don't try to make my insulin respond to those sort of challenges. And I will, to your point, Shawn, I think when I said I've never felt better, this has really forced me to take a really hard look at my health. And I've never been not healthy. Breast cancer, that wasn't anything that I did to myself, right? I've always been pretty healthy and took it for granted, and I don't anymore at all. And there's not a week that goes by that somebody doesn't think I'm 12 to 15 years younger than I am. And Ryan's a great example of that. He looks amazing. He's an incredibly fit, healthy, such a good guy. One of my best friends. So, yeah, so you're right. I think there's a lot to that.
Yes, that's it. And the thing about the kids is the parents, I don't want to deprive my kid of eating all the junk like all the other kids. And it's if you think about it, we spend a lot of money. I've got 4 kids. You love them to death. You try to give them everything you can. You spend money on their education or your clothes or whatever. You try to take care of them, but then you feed them garbage. And what do you think is going to come of that? And it's like the bar is so low for health right now. It's really not. It's unhealthy is what it is. And so to feel that your kids are being deprived because they can't have donuts every day of the week when all the other kids are, it's kind of a sad commentary that we feel that's what our kids deserve. They deserve to be unhealthy. It's really what you're saying. My kid deserves to be unhealthy like every other kid. And if you put it that way, it's a really different way to look at things.
It is. And when you look at where we are as globally, but especially in the United States in terms of our health, diabetic outcomes are no better than they were 10 years ago. So most diabetics aren't meeting their A1C goals. And I won't talk about the goals because I think the goals are wrong too. But most aren't meeting their goals. And we're more obese. We have more heart disease. We have more cancer. We are sicker than we've ever been. And yet when you mention carnivore or keto to somebody, they will tell you that we don't have enough research to show that's safe. Go ahead and show me that what we're currently doing is safe. I would like to see the evidence to that because all the evidence in my mind points to the contrary. Yeah. So that argument doesn't hold water with me. And when I go to my doctor and my LDL is 104 and she wants me on a statin because diabetes, I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. And so that now we've got all these people that are out there that are overweight and obese and sick because of our diet. And our solution is to put everybody on a statin. The system's broken.
Yeah. I mean, I think we tend to be myopically focused on that particular outcome. And I will talk about the targets because I just read a statement from the American College of Physicians. I think it was maybe a year ago I saw this, but the A1C goals for type 2s, according to them, used to be under 7, and now it's between 7 and 8. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. 8 is a blood sugar of 183 milligrams per deciliter. That's
an average blood sugar.
So you're averaging. Do you want these people to get their legs chopped off? What is the point of that? And the fact, the inability for, as Dr. Bernstein and Ryan and many other, I've seen just hundreds of people now that are showing that as a type 1 or type 2, certainly as a type 2 and certainly as a type 1, you can have a completely normal blood glucose and normal A1C. You can use it should be under 5.5 as far as it should be. Your goal should be a normal blood glucose because you have the tools to do that. There's no reason not to, in my mind.
And then there's always somebody that's going to argue with you about what normal glucose is, right? Or what a normal A1C is. And my daughter, who is fit and healthy and 32 years old, her A1C at her last physical was 4.7. Mm-hmm. That is a normal non-diabetic A1C. So when your doctor tells you at 6.5 or 7 you're doing great, you're not. And my last A1C was 4.5.
Let's talk about the reason we care about A1C in the first place. Why do we care about hyperglycemia? It's because they have potential to cause damage to all kinds of organ systems. Pretty much every part of your body is affected by
every diabetes. Cell in your body. Yep.
And so are you regularly getting screened for retinopathy and renal disease and all those things? And how is that doing for you?
Yeah. This is a story that I was actually planning to tell, and I'm glad that you gave me a great segue into it. I recently had a retina issue that was completely unrelated to diabetes. It's called an epiretinal membrane, where a little tissue grows over the back of your retina and distorts your vision. And they go in and they remove it, and it's not a huge deal. But I was freaking out that I was getting retinopathy when my vision in that eye started declining. Right. And so I went to see this retina surgery, and when I walked in there, he said, "Do you by any chance know what your A1C is?" And I said, "It's 4.5. And he turned and he looked at me and he said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "Yes, I'm sure. In fact, I have my lab work in my phone if you'd like to see it." He said, "No." And he said, "Well, that's great, that you must have really good control. But I will warn you that in diabetics, we almost always see diabetic eye changes." He was just preparing me for bad news. And when he finally looked at my imaging, he was like, "I've never seen diabetic eyes like this." And I said, "You also have never had a diabetic in here with an A1C of 4.5. And he looked at me and he said, "You're right." And I had that conversation. I saw multiple doctors during this thing. I had that exact conversation. What's your A1C? It's 4.5. What's your A1C? It's 4.5. Wow, that's amazing. Wow, that's amazing. Do you know not a single one of those medical professionals bothered to ask me how I did it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's an absolute shame. And I think this
Right?
is an important point because I hear people that are critical of low carb, carnivore, ketogenic diets, and they'll say, with regard to diabetes, all you're doing is masking the symptoms. You know, you can't swill down 75 grams of carbs and not see a response. But when I see not only, I've seen people actually with diabetic retinopathy, which have actually reversed it by going from a higher carb situation to a very low carb situation, often a carnivore diet. And so to me, that says not masking the symptoms of disease, you're actually reversing the actual disease itself, which is hard to deny when you start saying, hey, the retinopathy went away. Well, how is that masking the symptoms? That's actually treating the root cause and seeing it, because this is the whole reason we care about diabetes in the first place, is all these end organ issues.
That's like saying that improving your blood pressure through diet and exercise is masking the symptoms. There's no logic to that whatsoever. I think one thing that I did notice, people with peripheral neuropathy in particular, when they get their blood sugars under control, peripheral neuropathy tends to respond very quickly to normalizing blood sugars. I've seen it in so many people. So to me, it's if you're walking around and your feet are killing you and you can't do what you used to be able to do, get on it, right? The fact that none of those physicians wanted to know how I got that A1C, it really troubled me, because when I first met my current endocrinologist, I walked in there, she downloaded my Dexcom data, she walked in with the printout in her hand, and she said, hi, I'm Dr. Smith, and I want to know how you did this. And I've been with her for 8 years because that was her approach with me. She wanted to know how I did it. I'm like, that's what every single doctor should be asking me.
Absolutely.
And they don't. There's the lack of that sort of innate curiosity and the complacency of a lot of the medical community these days is why we are where we are.
Yeah, I've mentioned that frustration all the time, because I regularly, people in this room right now, they go to the doctor. We've got people with MS that's resolving. Literally, the plaques are going away. They're becoming functional, or some other, just like you, normalizing blood glucose, and no curiosity, or good job, keep doing what you're doing, and no further like investigation. It's just, it's a lot of work. As a physician, I can tell you, when you've got 40 patients to see in a day, and you're just flying from one to the next, and you got the nurses telling you all the patients in the waiting room are getting pissed off at you because you're running behind, and so you're just like trying to keep up. It's really, the medicine has become just it's almost an assembly line. Really, it's assembly line medicine, and so
it is.
You're taught to be very efficient, and you get rewarded for that. The more patients I see, the more scripts I write, the more I code visits. You just learn about how to do that, and you get the attaboys type of stuff. But it's not really healing people in a real way. It's managing them, and that's really sad.
But what's sort of a little bit of a dichotomy about that is that the minute you tell them that you're eating keto or, God forbid, carnivore, right? The minute you tell them that, they'll spend 10 minutes lecturing you on how bad that is for you, but won't take 2 minutes to ask me the question about how I got my A1C into non-diabetic range. So it's a little bit hypocritical, if you ask me, and I'm sure everybody in this room has had that experience at least once.
Yeah, and let me just, because you said you eat under 30 grams of carbohydrates usually. I assume you're eating animal products, probably a decent amount of meat in the diet. That's once you start running out of things to eat, you're like, well, I got to eat some meat. What does your diet look like? What does your diet look like day to day? So
my husband is I'll call him a non-carnivore. He eats fish and we eat chicken. He eats more of a sort of healthy, he eats more Mediterranean. I literally, like this morning before I got on this call, I had 3 perfect farm eggs. They were beautiful. For dinner, we're having some leftover chicken thighs that I made last night that had caramelized onions on them, and we'll have asparagus with that and maybe some mashed cauliflower. So I'm basically protein-led, filling in with veggies. I do eat some dairy. I like full-fat Greek yogurt. I put cream in my coffee. I make my own homemade ice cream that's absolutely divine with no sugar. It's amazing. And then I eat cheese. It's basically protein and vegetables. The only fruit I eat is berries, and that's in small enough amounts that it doesn't require a bolus. So that's my rule on my snacks. It can't require a bolus. And same thing with anything I eat that's not a meal. So I can get away with, a couple good sized strawberries or like some blackberries with a little bit of heavy cream and not need a bolus for that. And that's another way can I keep my insulin usage down and keep the weight gain at bay as well. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. And I don't tend to eat meat at home, but my husband can cook a mean steak. So a lot of times if he's having a piece of fish, he'll throw a steak on the grill for me. When we go out, I always eat steak. I love a burger without the bun. Yeah, that's my world. So I don't miss the other stuff that I used to eat. I really don't. Every once in a while, I look at a big old baguette with a crunchy crust on it and think that looks good. And then I think about chasing it for the next 2 hours and I'm like, not doing it. So it's a good deterrent.
Yeah, like I said, it is a deterrent. It's pretty good with that sort of thing. Just, you said you were 5'5", I think you said 130 pounds, so 60 kilos-ish or something like that. What is your daily insulin requirement? How much insulin do you usually inject throughout the day?
So I have a pump. My basal rate right now is about 19 units, I would say. And I haven't taken a bolus today yet. I don't usually need the bolus for eggs if I start out in the 80s. So basal is usually about 19 units. The most I'll usually take in bolus might be 4, something like that. So super low. I'm like 20, 22, 23 or less most of the time. And I really do modified intermittent fasting too, so I don't eat until noon. So I don't need a bolus for breakfast. I don't do breakfast, so I don't need a bolus for that. And it has made a huge difference in my insulin sensitivity. Just that long window of fasting really makes it, I think it's reduced my basal insulin needs by probably 2 units at least.
Interesting. You're under 25 units a day, typically most days, and you weigh 60 kilos. So there was a study came out, I think a year or two ago, looking at rates of cancer in type 1 diabetics, and they found people that were like 0.8 per kilo or more had higher rates for cancer than those at 0.5 or less. And so you're clearly under that. You're in the very low insulin requirement range, which,
I was actually going to mention that study because there's another reason right there to really think about how much insulin you're taking. And there was another study recently where it was done among diabetics, and half the people in the study, there were 1,800 people that died during the course of this 10-year study. I'm probably misquoting it, but of the people that died, more than half of them died of cancer, and the remainder died of cardiovascular disease. So when you look at the things that they warn us about as a comorbidity of diabetes and high blood sugar, and all you hear is heart disease and kidney disease and stroke, nobody's talking about the cancer. I've never had a doctor tell me that my risk for cancer was higher. I'm hoping that's something that's going to start getting some more attention because it's real.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sure it is. Hyperglycemia, and also dementia. This is something, particularly, there's a relationship with hypoglycemia, so low blood sugars, and dementia risk. And that often, I know Bernstein comments on that, saying he thinks that's because what happens is people on a high carb diet are often chasing. And so they overcorrect, they undercorrect, and they overcorrect, and they're always up and down. And so they end up with all these hypos. And how about, because this is one of the concerns endocrinologists have. We want you to eat that constant amount of glucose so you don't go hypoglycemic, so you can consistently be 180 or whatever the hell they want you to be at. But how often do you have to deal with hypos, and how do you manage that?
If I have a hypo every 2 months, maybe, if that, and it's almost always exercise induced. Okay. And that's one of the reasons I went to a pump, was because it gives me the ability to suspend my basal or lower my basal rate if I'm on a 5-hour bike ride. That was a no-brainer for me the minute it was like, oh, I can have a pump. Yeah, for sure. I'm doing that. Yeah, it is so rare for me to have a hypo that requires anything more than, I never have one that requires more than a glucose tab, because 1 gram of sugar raises my blood sugar 5 points. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, 1 gram raises me 5 points. So for me, a glucose tab is going to raise me 20 points. And I'm rarely low enough that I need to be brought up any more than that. So that study that was done in pediatrics of all the low carb in type 1 grid, all the low carbers, and they did a study of them. And the people that ate the low carb diet in the study had significantly fewer hypos than the people that were eating the high carb because they were using less insulin. It's so logical as to almost make everything else seem disturbingly illogical to tell you that you're going to go hypo if you don't eat carbs. It's just.
I think really the hypos are just insulin overdoses. I mean, that's really what they are.
They are. That's exactly what they are.
Your body is very good to defending against hypoglycemia in a normal state because you've got that glucagon response. You've got all these kind of regulatory hormones that will kick in so you don't get that low typically. And so it's usually, like I said, it's almost always in the setting of insulin overdose, overcorrecting, right, giving you 2 or 3 more units than you actually need. And now you're in the 40s and sweating and feeling like you're going to die and that type of stuff.
But I do think, though, for active people that, you know, the reality of an exercise hypo, it's real. And when I was first using insulin, it happened to me a couple times. And of course, I was too stupid back then to know that I should always carry something with me. Right? But for the people that are on these super long-lasting basals like Tresiba, when I was on here, I could figure out where the tail of my dose, where the tail of the insulin was, and use that time for my exercise. With those really long-lasting insulins, it's a lot harder to do that. And so I do see a lot of my friends that are active trying to figure out what's going to be, unless they have a pump, trying to figure out what's the strategy for avoiding hypos during exercise.
Yeah.
And the reverse, hypers doing exercise. I'm more likely to spike during exercise, especially anaerobic exercise, than I am to go down. So, and everybody's a little different in that regard.
Yeah, obviously the training intensity. And I sometimes wear a CGM myself, and I've noticed like my biggest excursions for blood glucose is exercise. When I'm training really hard and doing heavy deadlifts or sprinting, then I'll see a little bump there. Whereas most of the time it's pretty flat and consistently low. And but again, it's still, I mean, it's an overdose of the basal in this situation. It's always an insulin overdose where you get these sort of hypos. So it's one of those tricky things that, you know, it's interesting because I've talked to a lot of type 1s that have not gone on the pump for various reasons. So it's interesting to see that you elected to do that. It's, I guess it works well for you. Any issues? I think some people, pumps get clogged and maybe it's malfunctioning or something like that.
I use Omnipod and I can't remember last time I had a pump failure or anything that wasn't like, when I get a pump failure, it's usually static electricity that will build up and it'll just tell the pump to stop delivering insulin. I don't know if it happens with other pumps, but it's fairly common with Omnipod. But I rarely have problems with it. And one of the reasons I decided to do it was partly my career, because I spent a lot of time in meetings with high-level executives, and I did not want to have to like give myself a shot in front of people. And I will do it in a social setting, but I don't want to draw that kind of attention to myself in a corporate environment if I don't have to. So that was one of the reasons, combined with my activity level. And now every once in a while I take a pump break, and because I'm like tired of having stuff attached to me and beeping at me. And I think I managed just as well when I'm not pumping. My A1C didn't really change significantly when I started pumping. It was pretty low already. And I understand why a lot of people don't want to do the pump thing. And first of all, a lot of people can't afford it. And this stuff needs to get a lot more affordable. It's expensive. I have great insurance. I'm extremely fortunate, but a lot of people don't. And this technology is incredibly expensive.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even like the CGMs, and it was interesting because I talked to somebody that was actually a manufacturer of CGMs at one point, and they were telling me they cost them like $10 to make. They're not expensive, but they make them prescription, and you get charged ridiculous amounts of money for it. So they're in business; they're trying to make a profit. And the technology is not that pricey, but they do it. Same thing.
No, it's not. It really isn't, and it reminds me of, I had a client that was an optical company. And when I found out that the frames that they were charging $250 for actually cost them $9, it was, so this is a similar situation. And I'm not denying anybody the right to make a profit, but at some point there needs to be some a little bit of controls around that so that the people that really need it can afford to have it.
Yeah, let me go back to, because you mentioned LDL cholesterol 104, doctor wants you put on a statin. I think if I look at the goals for LDL, I think American Heart Association, maybe it's ADA, I can't remember who's got the goal on. That's under 70 for a diabetic. And then if there's some sort of additional history, then they want you even below 50, which is extremely low. So how does your endocrinologist, are they giving you a hard time about the fact that you're eating all the saturated fat and your LDL is above 100? And
my endo, she's much more, she treats me as a little bit of an outlier because her point to me is these guidelines are made for people who are diabetic and have hyperglycemia. Mm-hmm. She said, you don't have hyperglycemia. Yeah. So I don't want to treat you the way I would treat most of my diabetics. Yeah. And she brings it up because she has to. And I just look at her and she just changes the subject. My primary care, on the other hand, we had a pact a few years ago. I said to her, she goes, we really want you on a statin, blah, 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 blah. And I said, sorry, no. And I said, all right, let's do this. I said, let's look at my risk factors. Family history of heart disease? No. High blood pressure? No. Overweight? No. Sedentary? No. Do I smoke? No. All of those risk factors, I had none of them. And I said, and I don't even have hyperglycemia. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go get a calcium scan and get a calcium score. And if it's 0, we're never having this conversation again. And it was 0. Yeah. She still brings it up. She still brings it up. And I love her to death, but that's a box that she has to check. So
yeah, it's just have that discussion. And
Shawn, let me ask you this. What do you think of the research that I've seen that shows that very low cholesterol is also linked to all-cause mortality?
Yeah, it's clearly there. The critics of that will say it's reverse causation. So they'll say, well, the reason you're dying is because the reason your cholesterol is low is because you're sick and dying. And so they'll see that because cholesterol has roles in our immune function and a lot of things. Although there's literally data that's 20 years out and says these people had a low cholesterol 20 years ago die earlier than other people. So I'm not completely convinced it's a reverse causation. I think in some cases maybe, because somebody checks into the hospital with a heart attack. A lot of times their cholesterol will plummet because again, cholesterol is being used in an immune sort of stress function.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's a lot of conflict of interest here. There's a lot of industry funded research, and whenever you have this is the thing they say the consensus says, or the preponderance of evidence is, the preponderance of evidence is gathered by whoever can pay for all of the studies. So if these pharma companies have all the money to spend all this money on all the research and they're funding all this stuff, of course there's going to be more studies that support the outcome that they're looking for. So I have a hard time with people talking about preponderance of evidence or consensus. I'm like, well, who funded these studies and what did the other guys have? Where did, because I'm trying to get carnivore studies done and it's hard. It's hard. There's no money for that. We're very fortunate. We've got a few people that have been willing to donate to make some of that happen. But yeah, so I like the fact that your endocrinologist was at least nuanced enough to understand that these guidelines are based on the standard sick, metabolically deranged American. And when you're not in that category, and as a diabetic, your hemoglobin A1C is probably better than hers as your physician.
It is actually. Yeah. It's really funny because she actually started and she's Indian, and her diet is very heavy on beans and rice and that sort of thing. And she started wearing a CGM, and she said to me when I saw her last, she said, I was shocked to see what it was doing to my blood sugar when I ate those foods. And yeah, my A1C is lower than both of my doctor's A1Cs. Yeah. But I have the tools to do that. It's maybe not a fair comparison, but still it's.
Yeah. Well, like I said, you've got obviously insulin is a helper, of course. You can control that, but theoretically, and I've read that like the average pancreas puts out between 30 and 50 units on a natural human being on its own. And so you're still using less than what an average person might be putting out. If insulin has any deleterious effects, and we know hyperinsulinemia does, then you're perhaps avoiding that. But without insulin, you basically shrivel away and die. You've got to have that to put muscle in your muscles. It's more than just controlling blood glucose. It has a effect, as Dave, who did I talk to? Somebody was talking about if you have no basal, your body just eats all the tissue to produce blood glucose. So you just wither away. Right. This is what type 1 diabetics used to die of in the 1920s before the discovery of insulin. They could eat just enormous amounts of food and they would never put on any weight because everything turned into glucose and they'd pee it all off. So
yeah, and that's why one of the first symptoms with children is usually unexplained weight loss. And the fact that gets missed by pediatricians so often or dismissed as something else is also something that frightens me. It's sort of how hard is it for you to take a finger stick and test this child and get an answer rather than saying, oh, he's just going through a growth spurt. Every single year you hear a horror story about some child that went into DKA and died because they weren't diagnosed. It's tragic.
Yeah, it is. I think I talked to Dave Dykman and his kiddo. I think initially they thought he was just he has some gastrointestinal bug, just give him a milkshake or something like that. And of course, giving a milkshake to a nascent type 1 diabetic is going to send a kid into DKA probably. And so that was really bad advice. And I know it's one of those things where it seems like it would be easier to do, but there's a lot of issues with our healthcare system, and that's one of many. You're obviously a very vocal advocate for this stuff. Do you get people like giving you a hard time about this? I mean, saying, hey, you eat a plant-based diet and all that type of stuff.
Yeah. When I was first diagnosed, I had several people tell me that I could reverse this with a plant-based diet, which obviously is an indication that they don't understand what type 1 diabetes is, but also that this whole notion of a plant-based diet has become a form of gospel. And I understand that it works for some people, and I understand the ethical reasons that people would want to stay away from animal products. But from a health standpoint, it doesn't hold any water for me at all. I have several friends who are my age who are vegan, who are on meds for osteoporosis and proudly telling me that they're vegan. And I'm like, when you get to be postmenopausal, it is almost impossible to stay looking and feeling young without protein and significant amounts of protein, right? For me to maintain even the muscle mass that I have, let alone try to build any, I have to have protein for that. I have to have protein and fat for my skin. I have to have calcium and protein for my bones. There's not a single cell in the body really that doesn't need either glucose, right, which we all know we can get from gluconeogenesis, fat, and protein.
Yeah.
So you don't need to ingest the glucose. Your liver's going to make it for you, whether you eat it or not. So the only 2 necessary macronutrients for human cell development and growth are protein and fat.
Yeah.
So that's where I focus my diet. It just made perfect sense to me.
Yeah, you can make glucose out of protein or fat. You can make carbs out of protein or fat, but you can't make protein out of either of them. They don't have the nitrogen that's required. And then, of course, there are some essential fats that we can only get through diet. Yeah, so they're essential. And I eat plenty of protein. I'm probably 300-400 grams a day. I'm a big guy. I'm 250, 260 pounds. So but I agree with you. I think it is incredibly important at any age, but particularly as we get older. If you want to hang on to decent functional status, to feel good, and I think having decent amount of lean mass really makes a difference there. Yeah, the protein becomes essential for you. You said you had a Facebook group or something like that. What is your social media connections, or do you have any places people can hear more about this stuff?
We have a group for latent autoimmune diabetes, and it's called, if you just type latent autoimmune diabetes, it'll come up probably. And basically, we are not strictly a low-carb group, and I know you met with Paul Pyers recently as well, so he's another admin of my group.
Okay.
And we're really trying to get people to be thinking about low-carb. We don't require them to be low-carb to be in the group like some of the other groups do. What we're hoping happens is that they're able to see from the results that other people are getting, right, that changing their diet can help with their control. And I'm not ashamed to post my CGM trace every day or my Dexcom Clarity data. I will post it anywhere I can and when somebody's smart enough to say, how did you do that? Ask me, I will tell them. So I try not to be too evangelistic about it, but I feel like sometimes I'm a little bit over the top with it, but I don't know. I feel if you've been struggling and you find the door out, you find the path out, you want to share that path.
Yeah.
And that's what people like RD have done, what Ryan's doing. Bethany McKenzie, who's what I mentioned, Let Me Be 83 earlier. That's what she's doing, but for children. And it's the people that are innately curious, the people that want to do better are going to look at you and go, how do you do that? And then everybody else is going to make you feel horrible because they're not achieving what you're achieving. And everybody likes to call that crab mentality, where the one crab the crabs want to get out of the basket so badly that they push all the other crabs down to try to get out. And all they do is end up back at the bottom of the basket. So we always call that crab mentality. It's, you don't want me to do any better than you're doing, right? And that's too bad. It's unfortunate because you could learn something.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was laughing. I was looking at my CGM. I don't know if you can say it was 82 right now. So I was like 83. I'm at 82.
See where I am right now.
So yeah, it's interesting.
But you're we call you a type none, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm 109 right now, so I'm a little above where I normally am right now.
Well, you're doing all the activity in the meeting and stuff like that.
Well, a little bit of adrenaline of being on something like this, which is probably what's causing it.
And you ate. I haven't eaten yet, so I won't eat. I still got another hour worth of meeting before I get to eat. I'm looking forward. I got a super nice Wagyu marbled Denver steak.
That sounds wonderful.
And a ribeye coming. So, well, Sarah, unfortunately, we only have about a minute left, and I got to go. It's such a pleasure to meet you, and thank you.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Well,
this was great, and I'm really honored that you wanted to include me, and I appreciate the time. It went by so fast, I can't believe it's been an hour.
Yeah, I know.
So thank you, and thank you everybody else that's watching and listening.
All right, guys. Thanks, everybody. We'll see everybody back tomorrow. We have an open discussion tomorrow morning. So thanks, everybody. Okay, bye, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, folks, it's Dr. ShawnBaker here. If you guys are enjoying these success stories, you can become your own success story. You can do that by heading over to Carnivore.diet. You can sign up for a free 30-day trial and get started today. We're looking forward to supporting you. Our community is wonderful, and we'd love to see your success.